Today's episode is sponsored by Airflow Breast Pumps. Did you know that your health insurance will cover the cost of a breast pump? It is true, guys, I promise. In fact, many health insurance plans also cover milk storage bags, breastfeeding prep courses, and more. At Airflow Breast Pumps, you can shop top-rated breast pumps from brands like Medela, Spectra, and Motif without ever opening your wallet. Fill out their quick and easy insurance eligibility form, and they'll take care of the rest. It might just be the easiest thing that you do during your whole pregnancy. Just visit airflowbreastpumps.com/mommy labor nurse. That's AEROFLOW breastpumps.com/mommy labor nurse to find out why more than 1 million moms have chosen Airflow breast pumps to get their pump through insurance. You're listening to the Mommy Labor Nurse podcast, where you'll gain the tools, knowledge, and confidence you need to erase the unknowns, feel in control, and have an even better birth, no matter how you deliver. My name is Liesl Teen, mom of two, practicing labor and delivery nurse, and your host. From over 8 years and counting of working at the bedside, I know that knowledge is the key to an even better birth. So tune in each week to learn about all things pregnancy, birth, and postpartum from me, a labor and delivery nurse that's seen it all. And now let's get into this week's episode. Hi, Erica. Welcome to the Mommy Labor Nurse podcast. I am so glad that you are here today with me. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm doing well. I've been in podcast mode today as well. So hopefully We'll see if that benefits us or doesn't. I don't know. But yeah, doing really well. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, today's episode is going to be a very heavy one. So I'm so grateful that you are able to come back on the show. I believe your previous episode was episode 83. If anybody wants to jump back and hear Erica talk before, we talked about the invisible load of motherhood on that episode, and it was a fabulous one. But today is going to be a little bit heavier, and we're going to be talking about something called postpartum psychosis. But before we kind of get into that, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from, your platform, in case, we got some new people, they didn't listen to episode 83 before.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I am the founder of a platform called MomWell, formerly Happy as a Mother. We recently rebranded in the new year, and we're kind of like a full service mom mental health platform. How we started was through my own experience, actually, with having 3 boys back to back in the span of 3.5 years. And as a perfectionist, as a therapist, as somebody who wanted to really do things right, I struggled a lot. And I found myself going through my own postpartum depression and anxiety. And in all my schooling and all my experience, I didn't even know that maternal mental health was a niche or a specialty area to focus on. So the social media page came from there, then the podcast, and now we have a full mental health platform for moms.
That's awesome. I know you've grown so much since way back when you were on the podcast back. I don't even know if it was last year or the year before or something, but yeah, you guys are doing some amazing things over there at MomWell. And yeah, super proud to have you back on here. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
So can you start by just kind of explaining to our listeners what postpartum psychosis is, how it differs from other mental health disorders like postpartum depression, like postpartum anxiety, postpartum OCD, all these other ones that we kind of group together?
Yeah. So we call anything in this perinatal time, so pregnancy, postpartum-ish time, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And there are some that we're more common with, like postpartum anxiety or postpartum depression, maybe even postpartum bipolar. Mm-hmm. But one of the ones that I feel makes the news or has kind of a big impact at times is that postpartum psychosis, because it does come with some unique kind of high risks associated with it. But essentially what postpartum psychosis is a disorder where there is a break with reality. So in the early few days postpartum, typically, mom might start to have hallucinations or have delusions and hear voices and feel as though this is really truly happening and is very convinced that I have to follow through and listen to these voices or do these things because this is how I might save the world, for example, or protect people around me. And so while on the outside, some of the things that mom might be saying may seem very illogical to us, in this break with reality or in this delusion, it is so entirely like all consuming and convincing to her that she can't see that she's in this state.
That is wild. I know. And how scary for the person experiencing it. I mean, I can't even imagine.
Yeah. And so it's very rare. And it feels like, I don't know, and even a rarer percentage makes it to the news. Like it's not everybody who goes through this experience has this traumatic or awful experience. So we know about, like 1 in 1,000 moms will have postpartum psychosis. And of that 1%, only 4% will either die by suicide or, infanticide or something along those lines. And trigger warning, we may talk about some of these things today, and they might be difficult to talk about. A little bit maybe of a heavier episode compared to the invisible load.
For sure. Yeah.
But important to note that it's a fraction of the already very small percentage that we usually hear about and see.
Yeah, that's good to keep in mind, because I know in the intro I talked about how it's such a small percentage of people, right? But it's so important to talk about because it can be so severe for that very, very small percentage of people. So if there's, you have one person listens to this episode and they go on to experience postpartum psychosis, or they have a family member or something, and they're able to kind of, learn a little bit from it and resonate. That's why I feel like it's important. But I'm glad you shared those stats, because that's good to hear, not only for what I just said, but also I think some people are probably just afraid that this is going to happen to them because they hear about it on the news. I know we had recently 2 stories that kind of came to light. There was a girl who was an L&D nurse, Lindsay Clancy, and she jumped out of a window. I think she killed her, or she tried to kill all of her children. The younger one, I believe, was in the hospital, and then she jumped out the window and tried to commit suicide, but now she's paralyzed. And then there was another one, Ariana Sutton, who took her own life. And that was just not too long ago that we heard about this. So can you share a little bit of insight on these 2 cases in particular and help us understand, it's awful, but understand if there's anything that we can learn from them?
So to put the disclaimer out there, I'm not their healthcare provider. So a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be speculation, but I reviewed the 2 stories that you had sent over, and there's a couple of themes and some things that emerge. So one of the things that you had mentioned that I think is really important is, am I going to develop this? Like if I've been struggling with postpartum depression, or if I'm having intrusive thoughts, we can also talk about, is this happening to me? Like, should I be on alert? And this is the response I get from my community and from a lot of the clients is this could happen to me. This could happen to anybody. And there's a lot of fear that sets in. And so I want to kind of parse it out a little bit, because it's important for us to know and be aware of some of the warning signs and how kind of the cookie crumbles. With postpartum psychosis, there is a high risk of suicide and infanticide. It is considered a medical emergency. So while it happens rarely, when it does happen, we have to act quickly. And often the treatment looks like going to your emergency room. It will look like medications up front. It's also encouraging and hopeful to note that you can recover, and you can recover within a couple of weeks. It's very treatable. If we know and intervene swiftly, we can make a full recovery and not sort of play into the narrative that's happening in the news. Many women go on after and have subsequent children with a plan in place and, maybe preventative medications or preventative team in place to also have more children and be okay. Right. So it's important to note that, and also to note that with postpartum depression, the infanticide risk is not really there in the same way. It's not as high, but there is still a suicide risk. And that was with one of the stories that you had mentioned with the mom that had the twins, where it sounds like when we start to hear things like, I feel like a burden and nobody cares about me and these children would be better off without me, I'm doing nothing but getting in the way of this role. I wasn't meant to be their mom. I'm not good enough. That is the voice of postpartum depression. And while that is not a medical emergency in the same way that postpartum psychosis would be considered, it can range more on a continuum where postpartum psychosis, when it onsets, it's an emergency. All of the time we sound the alarm and we go in to emerge for care. With postpartum depression, I think what makes it a little bit trickier for people and what makes us fearful ourselves is that it falls more on a continuum from mild to moderate to severe to, sound the alarm. This is now an emergency. And so it is still very uncommon or like a low percentage. I want to say like 1%, less than 1% of depression in moms and in women, but also isn't to be like overlooked. Like it's still something that can present in a severe form. Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Not sure what you need to care for yourself down there after birth. I've been there. Not stocking up on postpartum essentials before I gave birth to my first was one of my biggest mistakes. I don't know what I was thinking, guys. But now as a 2-time mama, I know a thing or two about postpartum recovery and exactly what you need to make it through this stage as comfortably as possible. For a completely free checklist of what you need to stock up on for those early postpartum days, just head over to mommylabornurse.com/postpartum checklist. That's mommylabornurse.com/postpartum checklist, all one word, to grab the PDF for free today. So when it comes to postpartum psychosis, what are some of the warning signs or red flags that we can educate partners, family members, anybody who's surrounding the mom and supporting her loved ones? What are some things that they can be on the lookout for? Because oftentimes, I know how this is how it is with postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety. A lot of times it's the loved ones who are seeing these things happen before the mom herself is, she's experiencing them, but she's not kind of getting it yet,
Yeah, there's a lot of like questioning why this happens, and we don't fully have a firm understanding, just like we don't with, other mood disorders and things. Like there's not a concrete like gene or test to like diagnose, but we do know that there are a couple of risk factors, even preventatively or upfront, that we are mindful of. So if we've got a previous history of like bipolar disorder, for example, or major depressive disorder or other like significant mental health, like things that have come up in life, or our parents or like our mother had experience with that, then that puts us at a higher risk of potential postpartum psychosis. So there are some things that we might monitor for. And then if you've had one child, I think it's like 50% likely to have it again with another child. So you want to have a preventative team in place and be on, medications and things like that. But you can still have a child, and there are ways to help, regulate and control that. It's just you want to be well supported and have your team. So on the preventative end, there are some things like, is bipolar an underlying diagnosis? And we want to be mindful and we want to track with our doctor and have, some support in place. And then in the postpartum period, postpartum psychosis usually comes on in the immediate first few days, typically. And it will feel like a big shift for a partner. Like it will be when the logic isn't starting to make sense, or like we're talking about, some examples would be not wanting to feed your baby because you think your baby is like Satan and that you have to starve them in order to like save humanity, or things that are just very like a break from their typical characteristics in your partner. Now, I want to pause and note here for a second that when I speak about this with my clients and with moms, there's a lot of fear and it gets muddled up with intrusive thoughts, because we can have some scary and bizarre and grotesque intrusive thoughts in the postpartum period, very common, 99%. So those are thoughts that pop up out of nowhere, seemingly feel like a play in your mind, very all-consuming, and they might be about seeing again, trigger warning, like you dropping your baby down the stairs or the stroller going off into the water, or you intentionally harming your baby, like accidental harm coming to them, or you intentionally harming them out of sleep deprivation and feeling frustrated and just visualizing doing something grotesque. Now, that is different than postpartum psychosis for a couple of reasons. And I'm going to draw the distinctions is that those are rooted in the reality of the situation. They are ego dystonic, meaning I know that I would never do this. I know that this is unlike me. This is unlike my character. And actually, it usually creates anxiety and like this reactive protective response to like want to avoid that situation at all costs, right? Yep. So when you are disturbed by the thought, when you feel like, oh my gosh, I want to do everything I can to protect that from happening, that is not a break with reality. That is an intrusive thought that is so common to us. Now, the more postpartum psychosis thoughts, they will speak about something that might seem disturbing to us or like alarming, but feel like very, I don't know, like not comforted by it, but like, like it just kind of flows. It feels like it makes sense. It feels like common sense. Of course, I'm not going to, if my baby is Satan, of course, I'm not going to like feed Satan. That's going to take over the world. Like, why would I do that? And it just is very ingrained. It's a very like overcoming experience. Right. And so even that distress alone is a sign that this is an intrusive thought. This isn't, you veering off into psychosis. And these are very common thoughts. Can they be very disruptive? Can they borderline into like OCD and be disruptive to your life? Yes. And if that's the case, seek some support because there is support for that, because it's not to downplay that they can be very distressing, but they're not going to just turn into psychosis.
I'm so glad you made that distinction because I think that is what so many people are thinking like, oh my gosh, wait a second. I was with my infant and carrying him and I, saw a knife on the counter and I envisioned myself, stab it or again, trigger. I did a big trigger warning in the intro, but
okay, good.
It's like you think that and then you hear this episode and you're like, oh my God, I have postpartum psychosis. But that makes a lot of concrete sense to me. And I hope it does our listeners too. So thank you for making that distinction.
Especially if you haven't had intrusive thoughts before the postpartum. And I mean, hormones, sleep deprivation, the utter just exhaustion of parenting in the postpartum period takes those thoughts and really dials them up. So we know that like almost 100% have intrusive thoughts about accidental harm coming to their child. We know that over 50% have these thoughts about intentionally harming their child. Those ones really create a lot of guilt. And I find that moms start to speculate, like, is this coming from like a desire inside of me? Is this a premonition? Like, is this something, am I not supposed to be a mom? And we start to like attribute meaning to them, not understanding that our brain is sort of like misfiring these thoughts in this weird hypervigilant state that has nothing to do with our own desires or, our own like love for our child or anything. So it's a really important distinction to say that like, no, it's not you. And our brain does weird things and we can learn to ride those thoughts out. And that the postpartum psychosis thoughts are distinctly different, delusional in nature, and break from reality and are very believable to the person who's experiencing them and not generally distressing to the person who's experiencing them.
That makes a lot of sense. And side note, I'm so glad that you said premonition because like they can be almost, you think that it's that I'm having these thoughts because they are going to happen. I didn't know that would I never made that connection because I've had intrusive thoughts like that before. Like I remember with both of my kids having intrusive thoughts of finding them in their crib dead, from SIDS and thinking for the longest time, like, this is what's going to happen. Like, oh my gosh, that was probably just, obviously they were intrusive thoughts, but it makes sense that it was almost, because I'm thinking it's going to happen, that it ties into because it was an intrusive thought and my brain was not firing in the way that it needed to connect in there.
I think we place an emphasis on interpreting these. Like, what does this say about me? What does this mean? Is this because I need to be on high alert? And because these thoughts don't just come as thoughts, one, thoughts are just thoughts. Like they're
Right.
not actions.
They're not you. And they're not you.
Not a
Yeah.
reflection of you, your desires.
Yeah.
Like they're just a thought. But because they come with such convincing body reaction, like they really trigger our nervous system and they take hold of us with like a grip of fear, it feels like I should be on high alert right now, because the fear that can come with them is like, oh, I need to pay attention. So if we don't know how to name them and how to work our way through them, it is very convincing. It makes so much sense that we feel like something is wrong. And I remember waking up like that, as you said, like thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to walk in there and they're not going to be breathing. Like I remember being convinced that that was the case. And to walk in and realize like it was my anxiety. It was my intrusive thought. It was my sleep deprived, anxious brain. What a combination. And had me totally hijacked, had me totally convinced. So important for us to note, because once we name it appropriately, then we can figure out how to manage and cope through those distressing thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in light of these scary news stories that have, been in the media, what, if any, are steps that moms, women, their families, loved ones can take, like you said, if they do have a history of bipolar, or maybe this has happened previously to them? Is there anything that they can do kind of beforehand, them or their families, to be more proactive and on the lookout to minimize the possible risk to possibly getting postpartum psychosis?
I think knowing and educating yourself on like perinatal mood anxiety disorders, generally speaking, is helpful. Like we really feel moms from an educational perspective here to know, that there are red flags. One of the things that I see happen often, I was having a conversation about this morning, is if you are on an anti-anxiety or depression medication, or, lithium for bipolar or some other medication, and they have a primary care doctor who does not understand or is not up to date on medications in pregnancy, sometimes what will happen is doctors will suggest that moms stop and halt medications while pregnant. That is a big no-no. That is puts us in high risk, for whether it is postpartum psychosis or just like a relapse of a major depressive episode. Either way, we're at high risk for not functioning at the capacity that we need to. So if you're on a medication and thinking about getting pregnant, or are trying to get pregnant and you've been told you need to go off those medications, seek out a second opinion, have a conversation with a prescribing professional who is perinatal trained, ask them what their experience is in treating people in the perinatal population. There are reproductive psychiatrists out there, albeit they're hard to track down, but there are Mother to Baby is a resource for checking medications. Postpartum Support International has a hotline that prescribers can call if they need, consultation with a reproductive psychiatrist. So I would say first, don't halt all medication. Please don't speak to somebody and see what your options are. That's a big one. That's sort of on the preventative piece while trying to get pregnant or while pregnant. Another thing that we know that contributes to all PMADs, not just postpartum psychosis, is sleep deprivation. So one of the things that I really advocate for is creating a maternal sleep plan, a sleep plan for mom that is not contingent upon whether baby sleeps or not. I think that we are so obsessed with baby sleep and sleep training and figuring out baby sleep because we're so desperate to get our own sleep, and we see it as like the vehicle through which we get our own rest. But I have a whole free pamphlet on how to create a sleep plan for mom that is like separate from baby. We know that they will wake up. We know that this is something that, developmentally is appropriate for them, but we also know that we need to protect mom's sleep because her functioning and well-being depends on it. So this looks like trying to protect a consolidated 4 to 5 hour stretch of mom's sleep as often as possible, whether that is through, pumping for a bottle so partner gets up, whether that is bringing in supports in the form of grandparents on weekends and, or a mom friend or an auntie or something, and prioritizing and making a plan for mom to get some restorative rest, because there is a correlation between sleep deprivation and the emergence of a lot of things like postpartum depression, anxiety, and it also plays a role in postpartum psychosis. So that's a really big one I advocate for as well. And we don't naturally think to plan or prepare for.
No, I love that. And we will absolutely link that guide that you talked about. You said it's like a template or something that you can just download and it's free.
Yeah, it's like 15 pages, a sleep plan for mom. It walks you through all the different ways to get creative too. If you're a solo parent, like who can you call on? Like, yeah, walking us through how to plan for mom's sleep, because it's one of the most protective things you can do. Yeah.
Sure is. Well, if anybody wants that, it is in our show notes of this episode. So if anybody listening, go ahead and go there and grab it. It's free. All right, the sound of that heartbeat means it's time for this week's segment of Birth It Up, Baby. As this one says, my husband and I purchased your Natural Series course, and man, it was everything to us. We went into our little one's birth with so much knowledge and advocacy. I was able to hand my birth plan over to the nurse, who was insanely impressed. I kept saying, be like Raggedy Ann when I was going through contractions. That's awesome. Also, back labor is no joke. Yikes. Yes, no joke. I'm so damn proud to say that we had our little man with no medication or interventions. Didn't even have an IV started. I felt like a damn rock star after the fact, and I know I have your course to thank. Oh, I love it. Oh, I can just feel her feeling, like through her words. Oh, love it. My water broke at 7 p.m. Sunday night, and he was born at 5:50 Monday morning. I pushed for 12 minutes and was told by my midwife that I was a damn hero. The third time she said damn. See, she's pumped. Oh, I love it. Thank you so much for everything you do for expecting mothers and their families. It does not go unnoticed. Oh, I love it. Thank you so much. When you guys send me these messages, I love them. If you want to have an even better birth, just like this mama, head on over to mommylabornurse.com/courses to learn more about our 3 online on-demand birth classes. What if you are a loved one, or maybe you're the mom yourself, and you're listening to this and you're like, oh my God, my daughter or my friend, I think this is happening. What do you do?
So because we're speaking about postpartum psychosis specifically, and because it does evolve so rapidly, this is considered an emergency if we're suspecting it. And now it'll be pretty blatant. Like it'll be a big shift. I don't think it'll be like is this like, I think it'd be pretty obvious. Yeah. And it's like, we need to go to Emerge. We need to see a doctor and be evaluated as the safest place. And I think that there's a lot of fear for moms when I talk about intrusive thoughts, or when I talk about seeking help because of fear of children being removed from their care. Like this is one of the biggest reasons why moms don't talk about their mental health with providers, because there's such a fear here. But in any case, I think that should not hold us back from seeking help. We should seek help with people who we know are trained in the perinatal time of life so that they can understand the nuances. But when it comes to postpartum psychosis, we need to take action. We need to go into Emerge. Yep. When it comes to things like postpartum depression, it's about knowing the signs and having the conversations, or maybe offering to help prioritize their sleep, or doing some of these things. And then again, if it gets to a severe place where we're concerned or worried, then we maybe set up an appointment with a therapist or talk to your primary care doctor and initiate some of these conversations. And actually, that's what my partner had done for me when I had my own postpartum depression. It wasn't to like a state of feeling like suicidal and things. It was more in like rage and like, you know, weepiness, but still a real inability to function. And my husband was hearing my red flags of I'm not myself and, you know, people don't care type of stuff, and came home from work, cleared the schedule and booked me in with my doctor, and everything kind of shifted from then on. So partners play such a huge role in knowing what the baseline typically is, and then seeing when it varies from that baseline.
Absolutely. Yeah, because they are with mom most of the time. They're the one that's there the most. So they're probably going to be the one that's seeing it first. Yeah. Scary stuff. What about healthcare providers, us as nurses or doctors, or, you know, anyone in the healthcare field who is seeing these women maybe during pregnancy or afterwards, how do they play a part? And then are there any like resources? I know you talked about a few resources, but any resources for them as healthcare providers or resources as healthcare providers that we can provide to moms?
It's interesting because it comes in the time of a conversation right now where the Canadian Medical Association Journal just put out a universal sort of recommendation against the screening for postpartum depression and perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And so there's been some uproar amongst the, perinatal professionals here because why? It's running under the assumption that doctors are taking the time to do clinical interviewing, and it made a lot of assumptions that are just frankly not happening.
Yeah.
And so really leaves moms that much more like under the radar and falling through the cracks. So I think that as professionals, whether we're doctors or therapists or, prescribers, nurses, knowing how to screen, knowing some of the questions to ask. And if we have a hunch or if something isn't feeling right, knowing a little bit of what we're looking for. And there's some education in that, and not always do, we call them GPs here, general physicians or primary doctors, have the time or have the desire to learn and do that. But a screening is a really great place to start. And then for those who might work more in the birthing profession and in this realm, knowing, like we said, some of the things that put us at high risk. So if I'm like working in a birthing environment and I know that a mom has come in with like a history of bipolar or something, then I might bring up a conversation or have an information sheet to hand to the family as they're leaving. So there is a general sort of knowledge there, and it comes with like a screening and being aware to know when to have that conversation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And listening to episodes like this, hearing it, more helps us better as healthcare providers, because I'll be the first one to say when I was pregnant, well, not when I was pregnant, but after I had my first one, I'm a healthcare provider. I've been a nurse for 10 years now. I had worked in labor and delivery for a couple of years at that point. And I knew what postpartum depression was. I really didn't know what postpartum anxiety was because it really wasn't, people weren't talking. Yeah. So it's like this, I think also just helps everybody is just talking about it.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And the thing about the pregnancy and postpartum period that makes it so complex to identify, like 50% of women with postpartum depression go undiagnosed because these things mirror normal experiences in pregnancy and postpartum often, and not the break with reality psychosis piece, but a lot like the fatigue and the exhaustion or the worry and chronic levels of anxiety that are attributed to new mom worry. So it is hard for professionals who aren't, thoroughly trained as mental health professional. You're not a mental health professional. You're like a labor and delivery nurse or whatever your role is. It's hard to parse out what is a baseline and what isn't when it's all so intermixed and woven together. So there are nuances here. Sometimes things stand out as very apparently sort of maybe off baseline, and other times there might be question marks. And when there's question marks, like I think offering a pamphlet or like just initiating a bit of a generalized conversation can always help just to plant a seed, and then they know to be on the lookout or know to go research more themselves.
Yeah. Well, to wrap things up on a positive note, do you or can you share any stories of women who have successfully overcome postpartum psychosis? I mean, I know we can't, we got HIPAA, so we can't really share too much, right? But anything like that you want to share kind of to wrap up the episode to let people know that and I know you mentioned it before, that this is not the kind of thing that lasts months and months and months and months. You can get over this in a couple of weeks. And I think that's really, really important to note. But anything you want to kind of share, any stories you want to share?
Yeah, I actually had done a postpartum depression versus postpartum psychosis episode on my podcast and had a reproductive psychiatrist on. And I received a bunch of messages from people in the community who were like, my experience was, I had postpartum psychosis. My partner identified it. I got treatment right away and I had a successful mat leave or, new mom experience and things. That is more the common experience than what we see in the media. And we kind of take these things and sensationalize them and run with them, but that's not the most common experience. And I think that serves to kind of like shame and destigmatize talking about postpartum psychosis more openly, because we have this very stereotypical, idea of what it looks like. So there are many moms out there, and there are partners who catch on and identify and that have a really successful round of treatment. And treatment usually would look like medications up front. And this is a little bit different than maybe anxiety or depression, where we might try lifestyle changes. We might try therapy. And then if we're not progressing, we would maybe move to a medication. Postpartum psychosis is medication treatment first, and then maybe we work with a therapist ongoing or have a support system around it. But yeah, within a couple of weeks, we come out of that state and can mother effectively and successfully. And I'd love to hear more stories from people too, if they want to reach out, and we can feature those, because
absolutely.
Yeah, we need to destigmatize it more. So yeah, and you're doing that by having this episode as well. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, where can people connect with you? Because you do so much amazing work. And I know you mentioned it at the beginning of the podcast, but where can they find you, like on social media? We're going to link your sleep plan, so that's in the show notes. But where can people, if they want to follow you, where are you at?
Yeah, I'm MomWell on Instagram. We have kind of daily content going out there. We drop new episodes every Wednesday for the MomWell podcast, and we're momwell.com for all kinds of free learning resources, as well as our therapist team that's across the US and Canada, and workshops, all kinds of things there at momwell.com.
Lovely. Oh, Erica, it's always a pleasure. I'm so glad that you were able to come back on to the podcast and talk about this super important topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks, Liesl.
Wow, what an episode that was, guys. Oh my goodness. I just got off with Erica, and it's heavy stuff. This is scary, scary stuff that can happen. And I'm so glad that we're talking about it here on the podcast. And I'm also so glad that Erica really took the time to make a distinct difference between intrusive thoughts that moms have during the postpartum period, and how those are scary and they cause these reactions within you, and how those are so different from a break from reality, from this postpartum psychosis. Because I know that so many of you guys are listening to this episode, and before she started talking about that, you're like, oh my God, the other day I had this thought, and is this what's going on? So I'm glad she took the time to do that. Great episode. Next week, we are going to be talking about newborn reflexes. I'm going to be just talking about all of those really cool little reflexes that newborns have right at birth, and when they appear, what they are, and when they go away. It's going to be a cool episode. So stay tuned. I will see you next week. Already feeling a little more confident about pregnancy, birth, and newborn life? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can continue to erase the unknowns and never miss an episode. And if you're looking for even more, Instagram is definitely where I hang out the most. Come join our community of more than 500,000 moms for birth education, tips, and solidarity. You can find me at mommy.labornurse. Check out today's show notes and a searchable library of every Mommy Labor Nurse podcast episode at mommylabornurse.com/podcast. And while you're there, be sure to head to the blog to learn about our online birth classes too. See you next week. And remember, you can have an even better birth no matter how you deliver.